My brother-in-law Mike was dying of pancreatic cancer. He was given 3 months to live.
They told me that I needed to get my affairs in order.
My daughter was 12 when they told me she had 6 months.
The plane ticket cost $850.
The hotel room was $160.
Cab fare, $50.
Every month, we had to get ourselves from Albuquerque to Denver.
We've been traveling to my clinical trials for 8 years.
I wasn't going to let my daughter die, but the travel would cost me the house and send me into bankruptcy.
We found a clinical trial for Mike, but I felt something was wrong. The only reason Mike had access to hope was because he had a family who could pay for his travel expenses. And I realized that more people would participate in cancer clinical trials if they could, but they just simply can't afford it. So I started Lazarex. Lazarex helps patients find clinical trials, and then we help cover airfare, hotel, companion tickets, gas, and parking. We provide equitable access to advances in clinical trials for all cancer patients. And Lazarex is the only organization in the country that does this.
Today, I am cancer-free. The drug I took is FDA approved and available to thousands of cancer patients.
Today, we are grateful that we had Scott for 3 extra years.
Today, I should be dead or bankrupt, but I'm not.
Today, I have my daughter, thanks to the clinical trial and thanks to Lazarex.
Lazarex makes life-saving connections that give hope to patients now and opportunity for new treatments for patients in the future.
Access to hope.
Access to life, the possibility of survival.
And Lazarex makes it possible.
Please welcome Laura Minatos, founder and president, Laura Evans Media, and our distinguished panel.
Kick me to the curb, kick me to the side of the road.
Hello everyone, and we're so excited to be here because this is truly an underreported problem that is happening in cancer, and we have an incredible panel here with us today. First I'll introduce Dr. John White, who is the Chief Medical Officer of WebMD, formerly with the FDA, Director of Stakeholder Engagement and not public affairs, but
Stakeholder engagement.
Stakeholder engagement. We'll just leave it at that.
We'll leave it.
Okay. Dr. Edith Mitchell is next to John White, clinical professor and director of the Center to Eliminate Cancer Disparities at the Sidney Kimmel Cancer Center and Jefferson University. Thank you for being here. And Dr. Cliff Hudis, CEO of the American Society for Clinical Oncology, ASCO, which is the premier association in the cancer space. Thrilled to have you with us as well, Dr. Hudis. And Dana Dornsife, who, of course, as you saw in the video, is the founder of Lazarex Cancer Foundation and chairman of the board, and a big change maker in this space, as all of these people are here on the panel. So thank you. I start with a question for you, Dana. One of the things that I do want to establish here, it's important to note that every single therapy that we have in cancer today, or any therapy, any medicine, has gone through a clinical trial. So clinical trials are critical in medicine. My question for you, Dana, 600,000 cancer patients die every year. How many patients are you able to help through Lazarex Cancer Foundation?
So we're currently helping 700 patients per year, supporting them through clinical trial participation. But honestly, Laura, that could be tens of thousands of patients. We just need to increase our funding and our partnerships. And what I really want to focus on is how big this problem truly is. You mentioned 600,000 deaths a year, and that's in the United States alone. That's the approximate population of Washington, D.C. So we are literally, it's like wiping Washington, D.C. off the map every single year. And so, make no mistake about it, cancer is an epidemic. But unfortunately, it's become normalized, and people have a tendency to be somewhat ambivalent about it. And, for our patients, if standard of care or available treatments on the market fail to help those patients, they will die. So clinical trial participation is a lifeline for them. And quite frankly, patient participation in clinical trials is our lifeline to new therapies. So it's important for all of us to get adequate participation in clinical trials. And it's been our experience that patients will actually participate if they're given the opportunity to. And so LazarX makes it a point to get patients where they need to be when they need to be there.
And Dr. Huddis, following up on that, how would you characterize this issue when it comes to the state of innovation in cancer and developing new therapies? Would we be further along if we could boost enrollment, boost minority participation?
One of the big challenges we face right now in medicine is that there has been a rapid expansion in the number of drugs and even devices and interventions that might be beneficial for patients. So at this time in history, we need more and more patients enrolled in clinical trials overall. Within that, we need to have diversity within our clinical trials because based upon socioeconomic factors and others, there can be differences in the impact of those therapies that we're developing. The problem, which Dana already alluded to, is that fewer than 5%, actually about 3% of adults with cancer, especially solid tumors as opposed to leukemia, participate in clinical research, which means that 95 to 97% of the patients who get treated right now get treated outside of a context where we could learn and advance. So if we inverted that, if we had a system that actually massively increased the ability of individuals to participate and increase the diversity of the participants, we would make much faster progress and we would have much more realistic assessments of the impact of therapy. I'll close by pointing something out, which everybody who does research knows. By and large, the patients we enroll in clinical research studies and drug trials, we joke are like triathletes who happen to have cancer. The eligibility criteria are tight and narrow, and that applies not just to their physical performance, but often to socioeconomics as well. And that does not paint an accurate picture of what we will then see in the health sector when we use these same therapies. And that is, I think, something that's addressable.
Well, and as a follow-up, there was just an article that came out last week in ProPublica, and STAT was involved in this article too, that showed how Black people are being left out of clinical trials, just a small fraction, less than 5%. And the article said 1 out of 5 Americans diagnosed with multiple myeloma is Black, but only 1.8% of participants in a trial of a promising new drug were. And the problem is hardly unique to that clinical trial. So this article is getting a lot of attention. There seems to be a lot of outrage as a result of this article. Is there outrage in the medical community?
I would say there is, but I think what the medical community needs is broad public-based support to address this. I think that we need to have resources to allow us to gain greater access to the patients that are being left behind right now. And I think that's one of the things we can talk about here.
So, Dr. Mitchell, Edith, let me ask you, this article pointed out this very low minority participation. Plain and simple, let me ask you, if we could boost minority participation, would it make a difference in your opinion? And what happens also when minority populations don't have access to clinical trials?
Sure. So it's very important that all participate in cancer clinical trials because while we've made new advancements over the years, and over the last 23 years, we've seen a 25% decline in cancer death rates in this country. Yet there are still populations that share disproportionately to the death and overall mortality rates. And this article last week discussed that. What it did not discuss was that myeloma is one of the cancers where African Americans have about a 25% higher incidence of this cancer and a more than 50% higher death rate. Many are not reaching clinical trials, not participating, and there are really multiple factors for this. Many cannot reach the cancer centers where these clinical trials are occurring. Many do not know about them. The clinicians in their neighborhoods don't know about this. So there are multiple factors that affect participation in trials. And what we found at Jefferson is that if we educate the clinicians in the community who are taking care of patients, and there are communication networks where they can get their patients to the clinical trials, and then we work with Lazarex to cover some of those out-of-pocket expenses that patients have, we're able to get more patients into clinical trials. So in working with the clinicians in the community, it's really multifaceted, and we've got to cover all of the facets of participation. I will tell you of one trial in multiple myeloma, however, with the Eastern Cooperative Oncology Group. So whereas there were 1.8% in the article last week, we were able to accrue minority patients, and specifically Black patients with multiple myeloma. To this trial, we had 9% African Americans in the trial, and what we found were two important things: that if Black patients are given the same treatment as Caucasian patients, that the overall effectiveness outcomes were similar. So it's giving the patients the right treatment at the right time so that they can experience clinical trial participation. But we also found out there were some unique features of the cancer cells, the myeloma cells, in some Black patients with a unique genomic profile. So it's not only about the clinical trial with the treatment, but it's also about our finding the characteristics of tumors that allow patients to get specific, precise, it's called precision oncology. So getting a precise medicine that addresses the tumor markers in that specific cancer.
So obviously, that's wonderful, but it speaks to the fact that we need to have minority participation. And you mentioned the decline in cancer, but the World Health Organization just came out with a report saying that globally, cancer will be the #1 killer, the single biggest barrier to increasing our life expectancy. John, as somebody who worked with the FDA and working with trial sponsors, what is your reaction to that, and how urgent is this issue that we increase enrollment and minority participation and retention in clinical trials?
And you asked if there was outrage, and I would say there really isn't sufficient outrage. And I think there is not sufficient outrage. And I think part of it is a lack of transparency, and that people need to know the data. And I thought the ProPublica report is the first step. We talked a little bit about on the green room about, Martin Luther King said nearly 40 years ago that the greatest disparity is the disparity in health. And here we are in 2018, and we still have these tremendous disparities in cancer care, primarily based on the color of one's skin and their sex. And how do we allow that in the setting of 2018? And we referenced the low number of Blacks and Hispanics in clinical trials, typically 3 to 5%, and that number has not changed in the past 20 years. So it really takes a system approach to make these changes. And the difference in cancer care as opposed to diabetes, there are 10 great therapies that you can try for diabetes. And as Dana pointed out, if you fail standard therapy in cancer, you will likely die unless you have access to a clinical trial. And again, it's people of color, it's women that are left behind. So how do we address that? And I think that's one of the biggest challenges, because lots of people are well-intentioned and are trying to make a difference, but the numbers aren't changing. So we really need to take a step back and rethink, as Dana is doing. You know, are there the elements of the cost of a clinical trial? And people don't recognize there are, depending upon how certain things such as routine costs are defined, there is a fee. There are the other elements of daycare, of elder care, of giving up your time. Remember, healthcare is one of the #1 reasons of personal bankruptcy. So how are we doing it? So
and
unfortunately, I
we talk
think
about
we need to be
toxicity.
yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I don't think there's the outrage, Laura, and I think there needs to be.
Right, and you talk about what's the solution. So I know, Dana, through Lazarex, you've been at this for more than 12 years now, helping reimburse cancer patients who need to get to clinical trials for a lifeline, a potential lifeline. But you realized in that journey that there needed to be some kind of fix. What is the work that you're doing now through IMPACT, which stands for Improving Patient Access to Cancer Clinical Trials?
So IMPACT is all about, first of all, I want to give a shout out to Amgen, because Amgen, as a pharmaceutical company, boldly stepped forward to participate with our IMPACT program. And IMPACT, Improving Patient Access to Cancer Clinical Trials, is an institutional level program that's specifically set up to improve clinical trial enrollment, retention, minority participation, and ultimately to create a platform of equitable access. And we are currently rolling out that program in California. It's the first of its kind. In San Francisco at University of California, San Francisco, and then in LA at Norris Comprehensive Cancer Center. The next area that we are focused on is Philadelphia. Philadelphia, we're really excited about as an overall opportunity for IMPACT. We're combining two programs, our institutional level IMPACT program, but also another layer called Community IMPACT. And it's the combination of those two that we're hoping to really affect very positive change on overall health outcomes in Philadelphia, but also the health outcomes related to cancer. Philadelphia has some of the worst health outcomes of any of the major populated cities in the United States. But Philadelphia is also blessed with an amazing number of very high-level academic and medical institutions. And so with the cooperation of all of those institutions and the desire to improve health outcomes there in Philly, we're undertaking this public health effort and working a top-down solution through IMPACT, a bottom-up solution through Community IMPACT. Hopefully they'll meet in the middle and we'll be able to permanently and sustainably fix this problem.
And when you say top down, you're talking about at the institutional level. So when oncologists are speaking with their patients, or tell me about that top down.
Yeah, so well, part of the issue around clinical trial enrollment is getting the word out there, but really also focusing on removing barriers. We talked about one of the primary barriers to patient participation is in fact out-of-pocket expense associated with that participation. So IMPACT is all about when a patient is engaging at the institutional level and they're considering participating in a trial and then being consented to do so. Part of that consent process is including access to a financial reimbursement program. So all of the clinical trials, all the therapeutic trials that are being offered at a particular institution would include equitable access to those trials. And really, we're testing the waters to see if we remove those financial considerations from the equation if we can improve enrollment, retention, and minority participation.
And then it gets as basic as just using language, the right language to reach out to different communities, because Edith, isn't that so important that you've found? It's just the awareness.
Oh, absolutely. It's very important to be able to communicate with communities, with individuals who live there, and speak the language that is preferred by the patient. So, for example, in the Hispanic communities, many of the individuals do not speak English, so being able to communicate in the patient's preferred language is very important.
Because it's not just financial barriers, but it's also the knowledge.
Sure, and also the faith-based ministries. I find that working with people in their community, with their church, with their community centers, and basically in their space where they feel comfortable talking to you. I cannot just sit in my medical office and expect people to come in automatically. But if they know you, then it makes a big difference. And if they feel comfortable in talking with you, that makes a big difference in terms of allowing the patients to participate in clinical trials. And then working with the community physicians who provide primary care to communities also is very important, because once the patients get treatment, they go home and they may have questions or other medical issues. So I find it so important to work with the primary care physician. And many times the primary care physician has practiced in those communities for a long time. They can give the treating institution or physicians information that would be important, and also family history, in knowing if there has been a family history of various cancers.
These are all very important
therefore,
points,
these are all important points in providing clinical trials to individuals, and then working with Lazarex and others to assess the financial responsibility that the patient might have.
Dr. Mitchell, I do want to get to Dr. Huddis really quickly, because we're running out of time here, and to talk about the ASCO report, because this is kind of a groundbreaking thing. It just came out, just published recently. The first time that ASCO has acknowledged that there is a financial toxicity and this kind of barrier to clinical trials. Talk about that briefly, if you would, and then tell me what the recommendations are.
So ASCO is built to support the profession in the control of cancer through research, education, and quality of care. Our core values are evidence, care, and impact. And I say all that because this is not our first approach to the financial toxicities of care, but it is the first time we've done it in the context of research. We started in 2007 confronting the issue of high cost of care, and an outgrowth of that was the recognition that some patients, as you've heard from the panel, can't participate in clinical research because their insurance coverage is partial or inadequate and sometimes unclear in terms of research. So Karen Wingfield organized, she's a radiation oncologist who is very active in ASCO, organized a task force to take a look at all aspects of trial participation, and the results were, I think, surprising to many people. You think you have insurance, you go to see a doctor who offers you a clinical trial, and certain components of your care may or may not be covered depending upon where you live, what insurance plan you have, and indeed sometimes how somebody interprets it.
It's maddening. I mean, when you get to that point of before you even enter the cancer world, it doesn't make sense. But then you're there, then you get the news, and oh my gosh, what am I going to do? And all of this information is so hard to navigate.
So we call for 4 specific things, which I'll rattle off quickly. The first is to fix payer coverage so that it's clear and there are standard requirements for what is included and what is not. The second is to make the out-of-pocket expenses clear at the beginning of the discussion of clinical research. A big issue, which you saw a little bit, I think, in the movie and elsewhere, is that people find themselves immersed in the trial process and then wake up to some of the expenses like airfare hotel and so forth. The third is to work with government, Office of the Protection of Human Subjects, to identify an ethical way to support those expenses that is not an induction, which is a big issue. We can't induce people to clinical research, but we should remove the barrier against clinical research is the point. And the fourth, and I started with our core values, we always want evidence. So scientifically, we want research that actually quantifies and identifies all of the components of the cost of care that are not borne by the study, that are borne by patients and families, so that we can find tools to address it. That is the purpose of our paper.
Awesome. John, let me get your reaction, number one, to the ASCO paper. How helpful would this be in this journey toward change? And then number two, the impact program that Dana has laid out.
Sure.
Is that a good path forward?
You know, I think it's great that we're finally addressing this concept of financial toxicity. And I joked we need a better word for that in terms of to get people passionate about that people should not be able to participate or not participate in a clinical trial because they can afford it. This is about equity. This is about parity. So, you know, I think that's a great first step. We need to acknowledge it, and then we need to figure out different strategies to address it. In terms of Dana's point about impact, you know, I think that's great to have this multi-system approach. As we talked about before, part of the problem, let's be honest, are the academic institutions often don't sufficiently serve the community in which they reside. So how do we improve that? And how do we have this approach to acknowledge it, to address it? And what I love what Dana said is to have this permanent and sustainable solution. And that's going to be iterative. So we're going to have to try things. They're going to fail, but we're going to keep trying at it. But we need to, as Edith is doing, serving the community in which her institution sits.
Dana, let me give you the last word. I want you to just briefly tell me the cost of outreach and recruitment versus the spending that happens to keep the pharmaceutical companies to keep patients enrolled in clinical trials.
So the biopharma industry spends about $8,700 in order to get a patient enrolled into a trial through all the various media outlets, okay? It costs Lazarex Cancer Foundation $4,000 per year per patient to keep them completely enrolled, you know, in a clinical trial and provide equitable access. So, you know, this is a simple problem to, or a very simple solution to a very big problem of fixing the disconnect between the tens of thousands of patients that need clinical trials in order to survive, and the thousands of clinical trials that need patients to participate in order to succeed.
Yeah. We need supporters. We need people to come together. We need them to rally about this and to raise awareness and continue to carry this conversation forward. So thank you all for your enlightening thoughts and for your participation and continuing to carry this conversation forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Say the word and I'll part the